We are recording today's session. If you have any questions about this recording, you may direct message or chat or email us. This recording will be shared following the webinar with all the attendees today. It will also be shared on our YouTube channel for the National Center. There will be a number of ways to engage with our panelists today, and you can utilize the Q&A function or send a chat or raise your hand so that you can be unmuted to ask a question out loud. You can also upvote questions that you find interesting. And if anybody needs closed captioning today, you can click the live transcript button, which is the CC button at the bottom of your screen. If you don't see that button, you can click on the three dots that are also at the bottom of your screen, and it should pop up. You can click enable closed captioning. And again, if you have any difficulties with this, just let myself or Ben know via direct message. And just a couple more notes on using this Zoom webinar function. So when you are using the chat box, please make sure that you've selected panelists and attendees if you want your message to be seen by other attendees. For the Q&A function, type a question into the Q&A box and we'll do our best to answer throughout the webinar or during the dedicated Q&A session at the end of the webinar. If you see someone else has asked a question that interests you, you can upvote that question by clicking on the thumbs up icon. So this here is going to be the Q&A function that the arrow is pointing to. And the other side of the graphic is the chat function. So again, be sure to click on all panelists and attendees if you would like for other attendees to see your question. This is what the Q&A function looks like. And that's how the upvote works. All right, and with that, I will turn it over to Brian Manwaring, our director, to continue with the presentation.
All right, good morning, everybody, and thank you, Lauren, for getting us kicked off. Good day, welcome, and thank you for joining us. My name is Brian Manwaring, as Lauren noted. I'm the director of the National Center for Environmental Conflict Resolution, and I'm calling in here from Tucson, Arizona, which is where we are headquartered. Again, thank you for joining us. We actually had a couple of poll questions teed up for you today, and I was wondering if we can do those really quick, Lauren.
Yeah, I'll pull those up.
All right, so these were intended just to get folks warmed up and integrated in the session here. Please do feel free to respond to this question, and we'll display the results when the polling is complete.
All right, we'll just give it a couple more seconds here. And we'll wrap it up in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So it looks like the most popular answers to the first question: in the next 50 years, what are the major challenges you foresee in utilizing NEPA involving tribal nations and federal agencies? Are tribal staff capacity and federal staff capacity, which isn't surprising, seeing as how we've heard that over and over again. And I'll go ahead and launch the second question here. A little bit more of a fun, lighthearted question. So what do you carry in your toolkit when approaching NEPA processes involving government-to-government collaboration? We'll give you guys just a minute or two to answer that. Okay, so we'll wrap that up in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, and it looks like collaborative attitude and respect are some of the things that folks carry in their toolkit when approaching these processes. I'm a little surprised that snacks was so low, but that's okay. And I'll kick it back to Brian.
All right. Thank you again, Lauren. And thanks everybody for indulging us with those poll questions. As Lauren mentioned, that second one in particular was intended to be lighthearted, and we just wanted to essentially welcome people into the session today and give you an opportunity to interact a little bit. That second question, although being lighthearted, really any of those responses was correct, or it could have been all of the above. And perhaps that's just a reminder for all of us of a collaborative mindset and our state of being when we walk into a collaborative endeavor or collaborative setting. And perhaps that applies to us today. Lauren was joking about the snacks, but that's a real thing too, right? Food is a true way to connect at a human level, and also is a respectful way to show appreciation for the time and energy of folks coming to the table. Knowing this, and there's lots of federal colleagues on the line today, we also understand that there's challenges around providing food and snacks, whether it's a legal issue with fiscal law and appropriations issues, or just budgetary issues. But just to know that there are ways of connecting that go beyond just the work, and food can be one of those. So again, my name is Brian Manwaring. I'm with the National Center, which is a program, National Center for Environmental Conflict Resolution, which is a program of the Morris K. Udall and Stewart L. Udall Foundation. We are hosting this event in partnership with the EPA's Office of Environmental Justice, and we appreciate their partnership on this. Just a little bit of background about the foundation before we get started with the program. So we are an independent executive branch federal agency. The foundation's mission is really to foster leadership, education, collaboration, and conflict resolution in the areas of the environment, public lands, and natural resources. We also have a mission to support Native nations through activities that strengthen their self-determination and governance interests. We do that through a number of different program areas, and you'll see them listed here, but a couple of them include undergraduate scholarships, Native American congressional internships. We do youth engagement through our Parks in Focus program. We also have connections to the University of Arizona's programs, the Udall Center for Studies in Public Policy, and the Native Nations Institute. So next slide, Lauren. So our program is the National Center. We're focused, as you can see at the top of the page there, on enhancing collaboration and resolving conflicts involving the environment, public lands, and natural resources. We do that through several areas. One is through case services. That's mediation, facilitation, conflict assessment, and so we also have a training and capacity building program. And we also provide leadership around environmental collaboration and conflict resolution, and that includes promoting the use of collaboration and supporting co-learning opportunities like this event here today. Next slide, Lauren. So our program today, what we're trying to do, an overview of our 2-hour session really is to explore challenges that tribal nations and their citizens face while working with federal partners in the NEPA process. And we like to discuss collaborative tools, approaches, and opportunities to strengthen those partnerships and engender meaningful engagement in the NEPA process. This is the third in a series of 3 dialogues that we've held on collaboration in NEPA, and really the turning of NEPA into after its 50th year anniversary. So looking at the future of NEPA, our intention today really with this dialogue is to create a space for all of us to come together on a topic that's particularly important and timely. We recognize that there's a great deal of interest and energy on this issue. And this work, meaning the convening and facilitating these kinds of discussions and creating these opportunities for joint learning, is really at the heart of the Foundation's mission and the National Center's authorities and competencies. So it's one modest way, honestly, that we can be supportive of tribal self-governance and the collaborative relationships between our tribal and federal partners. So with that, I'd like to just quickly go over our agenda, and so we can move towards our discussion and our programming. So here's the agenda. It's pretty straightforward. So first and foremost, this is really an opportunity for a panel of esteemed experts to come together and discuss some of these issues, and then have a broader discussion with all of you included. So the first piece is really more of a structured panel presentation and Q&A. There are panelists' biographies available to you on our website, udall.gov, udall.gov. And it's in our news and events links, and I will put a link directly in the chat box when I'm done here. But we'll do that for about approximately 50 minutes, and then we'll have a slightly less structured discussion with the panelists and with you all. And we encourage you to ask questions and provide your reflections, and using the methods that Lauren had mentioned in her introduction. So we hope for a robust and vibrant discussion. Before I turn this over to our panelists, I would like to introduce the National Center's team that's with us today. So you've already met Lauren Cordova, who's a program associate in our Washington, D.C. office. We also have two folks that are sort of working on it behind the scenes, Ben Zakowski, who you've already heard his name, and Seth Cohen. And then Melanie Knapp also has worked quite a bit on this and supporting the planning for this event. So thanks to all those folks. Lastly, I'd like to introduce Stephanie Lucero, who will be moderating our session today. So Stephanie is a senior program manager with us. She manages our Native American and Alaska Native Service area. As I said, she's going to moderate for us. And so without any further delay, I'd like to turn it over to Stephanie and to our esteemed panelists. So Stephanie.
Thanks, Brian. As mentioned, my name's Stephanie Lucero, and I'm just honored to have you all here with us today, as well as our great panelists. I'm actually going to turn it over to our panelists and allow them to each introduce themselves. And I'm going to start with Kim.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kim Merriman. I'm a tribal member with the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma, and I am also the Environmental Assessment Officer for the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma. I'm coming to you from Lively, Durant, Oklahoma, which is in the southeast corner of Oklahoma, very near the Texas state line, east of Dallas.
Thank you, Kim. Cody.
Morning, everyone. Cody Dizitel, Executive Director now of the Colville Tribe and President of the Intertribal Timber Council. Also a member of the Colville Tribe. We're located in north central Washington State.
Hillary.
Hi, my name is Hillary Hoffman. I'm the co-director of the Bears Ears Intertribal Coalition, which is the nonprofit entity that advises, consults with, and staffs the Bears Ears Commission. And the Bears Ears Commission, for those of you who are not familiar with it, consists of 5 elected representatives of each of the coalition tribes, which are the Hopi Tribe, the Navajo Nation, Ute Mountain Ute Tribe, Ute Indian Tribe, and the Zuni Tribe.
And Kelly.
Good afternoon or good morning, everyone. I am Kelly Finizzo. I am the Deputy General Counsel for the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. So I'm coming at this from a slightly different perspective today, hopefully going to talk a little bit more about Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act and how that can interact with the NEPA process.
Thank you. And as Brian mentioned, I am with the National Center. I'm joining you all from Sacramento, California. And it's hot here, so my background is just exhibiting that little bit of our situation. So when we convened this session and brought you all here together, we wanted to explore in greater detail both the challenges and the opportunities to improve collaboration in NEPA involving Native nations and Indigenous peoples and federal agencies. And as Brian mentioned, our intent for this space is to really offer an opportunity to discuss in further detail where NEPA does fall short with respect to collaboration between tribal nations and federal agencies, and different ways that we could potentially increase collaboration, and what implementation tools, resources, or approaches that could work to improve that collaborative relationship, improve government to government interactions, and really improve the type of discussion and decision making that occurs through the NEPA process with Indigenous communities. In order to ensure meaningful discussions and outcomes in NEPA, there's a lot of different items that we need to take a look at. And so we're really hoping to both identify where those challenges are, but also think through some strategies that might have worked. And so in addition to sharing your comments and questions, our speakers will be providing some of that. We do encourage you to also share in the chat what's worked for your community, recognizing that each Indigenous nation is its own individual community, and what works for one community may not work for all, but this is a space of sharing and just finding how we can be more collaborative together. As was mentioned, there's some common themes we've heard throughout. Time and capacity, we saw from the poll that those were definitely big issues. We've seen about NEPA project timetables or permitting timetables. I noticed in the chat someone mentioned that. Also, how NEPA processes define the approach and analysis to impacts to Indigenous communities, both in terms of environmental and cultural resources, and particularly how Indigenous relationships are understood within that NEPA analysis process, and the connections with the natural environment. So these are all things we've heard and we've discussed in different areas, and I'm hoping we can look to our panelists to share both some of those components and other situations that they've seen in terms of the NEPA process. As sovereign nations, tribes have different ways to engage in NEPA, and I know all of you come from different avenues of that perspective. And I'm hoping you all can kind of frame for us some of the obstacles, challenges, and considerations that you've seen in your experience working with NEPA, as well as share any success stories or considerations for the larger group to look at or explore, and maybe integrate into their own NEPA processes and interactions, either if you're a federal agency, which we have joining us today, or a tribal member or tribal staff. So with that, I am going to reach to our panelists. And so for those of you on the line, the questions we asked our panelists to think about were framing the issues and identifying some of the challenges to NEPA, critical obstacles for tribal nations, and also fill in the gaps for successes, processes, and other items to improve meaningful consultation and collaboration when it comes to NEPA processes. Kim, I'm going to start off with you. I know you have unique experiences given your role at Choctaw Nation. And so if you can just share with us what you think some of the major issues are and where you've seen success.
Hi, everyone. As I mentioned, I'm with the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma, and we are down here in the southeast corner of Oklahoma. We encompass a little over 10 counties and a little over 7 million acres. We have over 200,000 tribal members. We're the third largest tribe in the United States, and we have the second largest area base. Now, we have all these members and all this land base and all these natural resources to protect, and we have NEPA, and we have tribal sovereignty, and we have a lot of other things that are thrown in there that make it rather unique. So I'll start with our state. Here in this state, we have 39 federally recognized tribes within the state of Oklahoma. You would think that would give us an opportunity to work and walk hand in hand with the state agencies here. However, that is not true for the state of Oklahoma. This is an oil and gas state, and we're not known for our environmental considerations for our state. So it's very important that our tribes are able to manage these resources within our reservation. Reservation is a whole nother word within the state of Oklahoma, because prior to 2020, we only had one reservation in the state of Oklahoma. We had tribal boundaries. There was a Supreme Court ruling called the McCain ruling, which recognized our reservation boundaries. We would think that would help us with our environmental considerations. However, in the state of Oklahoma, We have a midnight rider that was attached to a transportation bill in 2005. This was done by our lovely Jim Inhofe for the state of Oklahoma. There were very few people that were even aware of this rider whenever it was put on. And of those people that were aware of it, none of them were tribal leaders. So what this does is, in effect, it prevents us from being able to participate in environmental regulations under federal statutes without the approval of the state. That kind of steps on our sovereignty there. So the state wants to protect oil and gas and their industries. We want to protect our tribal members and our tribal resources. NEPA is a relatively new process for us here within the Choctaw Nation Environmental Protection Service. On our strategic plan for our 1, 3, and 5-year plan, we have an item in there to develop a NEPA specialist and to develop our NEPA program. We're doing that working with Shipley with their NEPA tools. They have some templates and some trainings and stuff that are available to our entire staff. It's very new to us. What we have done for NEPA in the past within our tribe is we have a relationship with the Bureau of Indian Affairs, good working relationship with them. And we're working on categorical exclusions and Section 7 clearances for our endangered species list. We do these clearances, we run them through the BIA. If there's anything that we need to change, then we can do that. We're working specifically with our forestry department within Choctaw Nation on some of these projects. And we've recently started a relationship with roads and transportations. Many of the things that they do are under categorical exclusions, but we also have those NEPA limitations that somebody else was speaking of earlier. Now then that we have this McGirt ruling, we do anticipate that EPA will reconsider the Safety Act, and we will not have to get approval through the state of Oklahoma moving forward, but we haven't gotten there yet. Now, one of the questions that was asked of me was, how do we participate in NEPA in our ancestral homelands? Well, we are a removed tribe. There was a treaty signed called the Treaty of the Dancing Rabbit in 1830. Our ancestral homelands are in Mississippi. And in 1830, 31, and 32, we had forced removal of our tribal members, and we were brought over here to the great state of Oklahoma for our reservation, where we were supposed to get to live happily ever after. It's not exactly worked out that way. Now, for projects that are on our ancestral homelands, what happens is they send out scoping letters for the public. We're not the public. We should be having government to government consultation. So these form letters come through, and they may wind up on the chief's desk. They may wind up on one of our environmental desks, and they may wind up in the Tribal Historic Preservation Office. They don't look like anything special. They're form letters. We may see them before the time period is up. We may not. At this time, in my office, we have not worked on any NEPA projects in our ancestral homelands. However, our Tribal Historic Preservation Office, of course, does their the TIPA things. She said they don't have the staff or the capacity to work with NEPA in the ancestral homelands, and we don't know that we have any treaty rights there. And if we did, it would be really hard to implement those without the possession of the property. I'm not saying that that's not something that we won't be considering in the future, but we have staffing issues here too, and we're just in the infancy of developing our program. Whenever I think about what kind of concerns we may have in the future, we want to take over doing our NEPA documents internally, but I have a little fear of that too. Like whenever we are walking hand in hand with contractors that have experience doing this, then if something goes wrong, it's not going to fall back on us. So I'm a little bit scared of that part of it, but we're moving forward with that. These series of trainings and webinars have been very helpful because it has shown me some of the things that are available out there to help us to move forward with our self-determination and our sovereignty and being able to manage our resources within our reservation and also in our ancestral homelands So I really appreciate you inviting us here today.
Thank you, Kim.
Mhm.
I think you started us off with some really great framing and thoughts to consider. I'm going to move over. We have a couple questions for you in the chat. You might want to take a look, and we're moving those over to the Q&A as well. I do encourage folks to send their questions to the Q&A. We'll try to answer them throughout. But I do want to turn it over to Cody and hear from Cody about what are some of your thoughts in terms of NEPA processes and best practices and obstacles.
So we've had a fair bit of collaboration, particularly with the adjacent national forest, the Colville, and to some extent with the Okanagan-Wenatchee. So we've got a fair bit of experience with this, but one of the challenges that we faced, and it took us a while to figure this out, was definitions. What we were familiar with NEPA on the BIA side, and how they structured or how they defined where they were in the process on the Forest Service side. So when we, on a regular basis, I would hear the Forest Service staff say, we're almost done. And I would look at what their proposal was, and it was somewhere in the very beginning steps of what we would consider a NEPA process. So I think definition is important, and it's important to understand that up front, because we were probably 2.5 years into a 4-year planning process before I grasped the fact that what they were defining as almost done was nowhere near what I considered done compared to our process. And we have a number of authorities available now that give us the opportunity to work with other federal agencies. So we had expansion of the Good Neighbor Authority to tribes and counties in the 2018 Farm Bill. That Farm Bill also expanded the use of 638 contracting authority to Tribal Forest Protection Act projects. So tribes have a number of opportunities, both from a jurisdictional perspective and a funding perspective, to work with their respective federal agencies next door, primarily the Forest Service and BLM with the Tribal Forest Protection Act. But again, there's a lot of confusion. Once those authorities were passed, we worked with the WO for the Forest Service to try to develop what that 638 contract looked like. And it's actually a 638 agreement on the Forest Service side. But that process took us every bit of a year. And it took us probably 6 to 8 months before the Forest Service WO even grasped what that potentially would look like to start those conversations with the Intertribal Timber Council. So it's challenging because there's differences in how we do business, particularly if you're looking at DOI versus Department of Ag bureaus or agencies. So those are some of the challenges. There's, I think, some successes that have been demonstrated around the country. So I think there's templates that folks can use, but I would note that there's some differences, some independence that each of the respective regions has about how they conduct business. So it's not always consistent across the board. So it's very important to reach out to those regional office contacts and see how they understand the agreement, what they think the funding mechanism is, how that funding will be transferred between agencies, whether that's the Forest Service and tribe, or BLM and tribe. And then try to structure what the application looks like, what a budget looks like, what responsibilities the tribes will have versus what the federal agencies will maintain. And also understanding that while the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act really strived to move tribes towards self-governance, where they had control of their own destinies and it wasn't dependent on federal agencies, that authority, I'm not sure, well, it was limited to projects in the Farm Bill. So when we look at Tribal Forest Protection Act projects, we're really trying to accomplish some management objective that provides some protections to reservations or tribal interests that are protected through executive order, treaty, or some other mechanism. So that's another important component I think to consider, and recognizing that there will have to be a federal line official that ultimately signs that NEPA document. And if you're familiar with Indian country, we just don't have litigations. They almost never exist on NEPA documents. And then they're rare in the Forest Service. I think the misconception is they have a lot of them, but the vast majority of them happen in 2 very specific geographic regions. But even when they do, the agency is mindful of that. So their NEPA documents will likely look a lot different than those of yours in Indian country within the BIA. The Forest Service, in my experience, tends to put together legal documents that they can defend in court, where the tribal documents tend to be more geared toward what the actual environmental impacts are and how we mitigate for them. So those are all kind of unique things that about how we do business. And again, with that communication up front, you can kind of explain what those differences are and how you work through those to get to a NEPA document at the end that everybody agrees to and a federal line official is comfortable signing off on.
Great.
I covered
Thank
all,
you.
Stephanie?
That was great. Thanks, Cody. And you were mentioning a lot of 638, and if I recall correctly, you also have some experience with taking over components of the NEPA analysis through 638 in some situations. Would you say that's a good practice, or?
It's very dependent on what capacity the tribe has. So at Colville, I as the natural resource division director, I had a big division. I had about 600 staff. So I had a lot of capacity to help with priorities that were important to the tribe. So when we look at like big game habitat to make sure we had subsistence hunting opportunities on the Forest Service land, that staff consists of about 180 people. So I had folks that could help contribute the NEPA sections, spell out specific management objectives we were trying to accomplish. We have a big history and archaeology staff that can maintain and probably produce a better cultural resource portion of a NEPA document than what the Forest Service had capacity to do. But again, Colville's a little unique in Indian country because we're a big organization comparatively. There's a lot of tribes that don't have that many staff. So it's really dependent on what those tribal priorities are. Do you have the technical and staff capacity to take on those responsibilities? And if you do, there's flexibility within the Tribal Forest Protection Act request to do those things individually. But again, those are all subject to a federal line official signature at the end.
Great. Thank you, Cody, for adding that. And Hillary.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for allowing me to join this conversation today. And I'm already learning so much that will be of use in the Bears Ears National Monument. So I'm going to speak with respect to two NEPA deep dives that I've taken in my career, both somewhat unexpectedly. The first was in the Dakota Access Pipeline litigation, and then the second is my experience working for the Intertribal Coalition in the Bears Ears National Monument. So when I was thinking about how to answer and approach these question prompts, I thought I sort of organized my remarks around where NEPA falls short. And then at the end, I think I'll have some time to talk about definitely not best practices. I can't speak to best practices, but maybe some, or at least one example of something that has been successful. So in terms of where NEPA falls short, I think there's a category of structural challenges and then maybe another category of implementation challenges. And maybe those two blend together, but I've separated them. I'm a lawyer by training. And so structurally, I think about some of the impediments that I've heard others mention. So it can be problematic that NEPA binds and governs the actions of the federal agencies when they collaborate with tribes, but it doesn't necessarily bind tribes on that side of things. So in a circumstance like the Bears Ears, where the tribal commission is using a sovereignty model to exercise tribal sovereignty on so-called federal lands that are the ancestral lands of the tribes, but not currently Indian country, their actions are not necessarily restricted directly by NEPA, whereas the federal partners are. So that can pose a problem in terms of how NEPA applies to the design of the collaborative management process and the ultimate management actions. In addition, tribal governments have their own governance requirements that may or may not overlap or intersect with NEPA's. So in the worst case, they might require an action or a process that inhibits, contradicts, or delays NEPA processes. And I think that's something that, in my experience, hasn't been entirely planned for on the agency side. So having a really good understanding of tribal governance processes, especially when dealing with multiple tribes, seems critical to me on the federal side in terms of planning maybe future best practices and models for NEPA and how it applies generally. When it comes to implementation, I would again mention the complications of tribal governance processes. So There may be a lack of fluency in tribal political processes, tribal law, a lack of understanding in just the basic legal pluralism structure in the United States, where tribal governments are sovereign nations and they have their own systems of government, their own laws, and those laws bind their members and to some degree impact non-members in their activities in Indian country and sometimes outside of Indian country. So I think that one area where I've seen a need for improvement on the federal agency side is in more training and understanding those, the complications that those types of governance processes can pose. Also, agency discretion and changing approaches to implementing NEPA can be surprising to tribal representatives. So I think I've seen that in both the Dakota Access Pipeline situation and then also in Bears Ears. So changing agency interpretations of the statute and the regulations can take even, well-trained tribes with extensive capacity by surprise. And that can pose problems for the efficacy of the NEPA process. Also, in other instances, tribal representatives may be encountering NEPA for the first time. And I think that in those circumstances, it can be a barrier to effective implementation of the statute if the agency can't provide additional resources, whether it's training or other types of resources to those tribal representatives. And even with extensive support and background and training, I think sometimes NEPA's complexity, the way that the courts interpret NEPA provisions and regulations can alienate tribal representatives and inhibit effective collaboration between agencies and tribes. I think I mentioned some specific reasons for this might include a lack of funds for training tribal representatives, a lack of time. So in both of the NEPA processes that I've been a part of, the time pressures that were imposed in some cases directly from the White House on agencies didn't allow for any type of training or even in the case of Dakota Access Pipeline, any real meaningful engagement around NEPA. And then I would say there's also another challenge on the implementation side and the lack of some cultural and historic fluency in the agencies when their actions impact tribal treaty rights, tribal sovereignty, tribal cultural resources, especially intangible cultural resources. And that those, even the best intended agency staff sometimes can unwittingly end up sideways with respect to tribal representatives because of that lack of understanding, which inhibits the implementation of NEPA. So obstacles to tribal nations' participation in NEPA processes, I think this could easily be a book, but I wanted to just remark on two. I've heard both of them already. So time is a big obstacle. I mentioned that in the case of the Dakota Access Pipeline. Also, just as a general matter, sometimes agencies have flexibility with respect to deadlines, but in other instances, there are statutory or regulatory deadlines that the agencies have to comply with, and they can't necessarily extend or alter them if there are certain tribal processes that have to happen in like a collaborative relationship. So I think in the Bears Ears, we're seeing that, even like in the best planned situation, that there are things that come up with the time pressure that crunches both sides, and that makes it difficult for there to be really deep and meaningful collaboration around certain pieces of land management planning because of those statutory and regulatory deadlines. So I think, thinking again about the governance structure of the tribe or tribes with which the agency is working, thinking about what type of governance structure is it? Is it a council? Is it, does it require some sort of legislative approval or presidential approval? In the Bears Ears, we have different governance structures between the 5 tribes, so that complicates things tremendously for the agencies. And but it's also important for the agency staff to understand those complexities to help navigate the NEPA process. If it's a council form of government and council meets once a month and there's a 30-day NEPA window, is it even going to be possible for council to approve the tribal representatives' ability to make a certain decision about collaborative management within the window that NEPA allows? Things like that, I think, need to really be planned for in advance, ideally. Communication is a huge obstacle. So in the Dakota Access Pipeline planning process, the record was replete with issues of a lack of communication, such as the one that Kim was talking about with, one email that's sent, that can tick the box of consultation under the NHPA. Nobody gets it, or the wrong person gets it, and then because the box is ticked, everybody moves on. And then in the case of the DAPL, the ineffective consultation with the tribes resulted in the NEPA violation, because the tribes had been saying all along that the leak detection system that was offered as part of the environmental assessment that was done by the Army Corps of Engineers, that it wasn't adequate to detect leaks. And then ultimately, that's what Judge Boasberg found in his final decision that invalidated the easement that allowed the construction to be completed on the Dakota Access Pipeline. So that was all due to poor communication or inadequate communication at the outset. I will say about communication, I think that's one area where it's a problem that can be solved. So that's where there can be course corrections that can happen, and especially if there's a good relationship and there's a commitment to collaboration. That's a problem that can be solved, whereas sometimes the time problem is one that is potentially immovable or insurmountable. I also have a little bit more about best practices in terms of the incorporation of traditional ecological knowledge in the Bears Ears, but I think I'll maybe leave that until a later point in the discussion and let Stephanie move on to the next panelist so I can learn more. Thank you again.
We'll definitely circle back with you, Hillary. I did want to give Kelly an opportunity to share some thoughts. We've already gotten a lot of questions on NHPA, and I saw you answered one of those in the Q&A, Kelly, and there's been reference, Kim mentioned, how that's coordinated in terms of tribal engagement in different NEPA processes where the cultural resource specialist might be having a more active role in certain processes just because of time capacity, expertise, etc. So I'm just going to turn to you, Kelly, and let you share what your thoughts are.
Sure, thank you. And I also want to thank the other panelists. I too am learning a lot, and I love these kind of opportunities to hear from others, and particularly sometimes hearing more about the processes that are slightly out of our swim lane. So obviously, the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, we're in the 106 world. We're under the National Historic Preservation Act, but we swim into NEPA quite a bit. And I think, you all have raised a number of really crucial issues that may either originate or stem from some NEPA implementation issues, but also can flow into 106 or vice versa. So I wanted to highlight a few things about 106 and the National Historic Preservation Act. I am sure this is common knowledge, but I think it's important to start from this perspective. And so while Indian tribes, Native Hawaiian organizations may not be called out in the statutory language of NEPA, they are in the National Historic Preservation Act, and that's very significant. Those 1992 amendments, I think with which we're pretty familiar, did a number of things, imposed requirements on federal agencies to consult with Indian tribes and Native Hawaiian organizations, regardless of location, so both on and off tribal lands. And they also explicitly recognized that properties of significance to tribes and Native Hawaiian organizations can be eligible for listing on the register. And I think that second part, the amendments did a number of other things as well, but that second part regarding the register is important for our 106 world, because I think one of the challenges and opportunities really when we look at 106 versus NEPA, 106 has this consultative aspect that's the heart of the review process. We define consultation as seeking consensus, which is a really big deal. We want to find agreement if possible among the federal agency, its state partners, its tribal partners, and other consulting parties. But, we are limited in the 106 review to looking at historic properties, whereas NEPA has a much broader resource mandate. We can look at sacred sites, we can look at landscapes, we can look at natural resources that may have a number of other points of significance, and it's not so limited to that eligibility criteria for the National Register. So I think that's one of the reasons why NEPA and 106 really do need to be married up to get a total world view of the impacts to a variety of different resource types. About coordination with 106 and NEPA, I'm sure you're all aware as well, the NEPA regulations have been changing since 2020. They changed again this past year. We may see changes again in the future. And we have to keep tabs on that because I think we're seeing a lot of important distinctions, particularly with definitions of effect that will have real life implications for our review processes. In the Q&A, I posted our website where we've provided some brief updates on how those terms have changed and how they compare between NEPA and 106, as well as an updated flow chart. The fundamental process still remains the same as far as points of coordination, but there's some tweaks that folks should be aware of. So when we look at Section 106, although it is an independent federal law, it sets up different requirements. There's a different threshold to review under NEPA than there is to 106. There are some clear crossovers. One of the things I'd like to talk about with 106 are opportunities for building partnerships, for building trust between federal agencies and Indian tribes and Native Hawaiian organizations because we have this consultative relationship and requirement. So in the regulations implementing Section 106, there's some clear expectations set for federal agency responsibilities. They must make a reasonable good faith effort to identify any Indian tribe or Native Hawaiian organization who may attach significance to a property that could be affected by an undertaking. We must, as federal agencies, recognize the government-to-government relationship between the federal government and Indian tribes, as well as the sovereign status of those tribes, conduct consultation in a manner that is sensitive of that tribal sovereignty, and then importantly, when we're talking about identifying impacts and effects and properties, recognizing the special expertise that tribes and Native Hawaiian organizations have in evaluating properties of significance to them. And I think this is where Hillary may start to bring up the question or the issue of Indigenous knowledge used in federal review processes. And we are seeing a massive shift in the 106 arena to looking to Indigenous knowledge for this information. Hand in hand with that, of course, is the confidentiality concerns. And there is a provision in the National Historic Preservation Act, Section 304, that can protect certain information about historic properties, but that's not limited to the 106 arena. Section 304 can be used under NEPA as well. It is limited in the sense the information has to be, again, about that historic property, one that is eligible for listed on the National Register, but nonetheless, it is a strong confidentiality provision that agencies, that state historic preservation offices, tribal historic preservation offices, local governments, others can use. A few tools that exist under the National Historic Preservation Act that might either guide or at least increase partnership arrangements between federal agencies and tribes can be developed consultation agreements under the Section 106 regulations that allow tribes and Native Hawaiian organizations to tell the federal agency, this is how we want to consult. This is when we like to be communicated with. This is who the appropriate points of contact are. We also have in the Act itself a recognition that tribal preservation ordinances can replace the Section 106 regulations in certain circumstances. And that's really cool. And we've seen this go into effect in at least with two tribes so far. So there are opportunities, although it's a separate legal requirement, to utilize this framework, this push for greater coordination, greater collaboration under Section 106 that hopefully can be used in the NEPA arena as well. So I'll stop for now, but I look forward to talking about more of these issues and questions.
Thank you, Kelly. I found that helpful, so I really appreciate it. I just want to give our panelists a chance if you wanted to add anything. Hillary, I know you wanted to mention a little bit about Indigenous traditional ecological knowledge with Bears Ears, and perhaps that ties in with some of what Kelly was sharing or not. So I'll turn to you first, see if you had anything to add.
Well, I guess what I wanted to add is that, or what I wanted to say originally, not in response, but just by way of mentioning that the way that the Bears Ears Coalition tribes have sought to use and apply TEK or TIK as they define it is through a tribal land management plan. So they actually, before I joined the coalition, over a 2-year period, consulted and drafted a tribal, basically like a vision statement and land management plan that incorporates all of the TEK and TIK, at least at a high level, the values, some of the shareable TIK into this document. So I wanted to mention that was, I think it could end up being a really groundbreaking way of incorporating TEK into NEPA processes. I think the extent to which it will be incorporated is kind of an open question, but it's the tribes drafted it in the hopes that that elements of their plan will become incorporated into the final collaborative monument management plan that comes out in the spring of 2024. And then because the document is 110 pages long, and I'm happy to provide a link to it. It's currently on the coalition website and it's been released to the general public. So it's available for anybody who'd like to go and look at it. And, you know, the coalition staff and myself are happy to answer questions about it. But it will require some ongoing translation and explanation by different cultural resource specialists within the coalition tribes. So the idea is that this will be a starting point, but that it will be a living document and that it will grow and change throughout this process as it needs to. So it wasn't intentionally designed as a NEPA document, but because NEPA is the vehicle through which monument management planning is occurring, it's ended up becoming a real foundational part of the NEPA process in Bears Ears. And then I think I'll leave it there unless so there was also, I guess, maybe one thing I would say in response to what was it Catherine who was just talking about, or no, Kelly, I'm sorry, was just talking about confidentiality and protecting sensitive information. That was really interesting and informative for me to hear. And it gave me a lot to think about because one of the concerns in Bears Ears is navigating that fine line between providing the information that assists the collaborative process, but retaining the information that shouldn't be shared. And so I think, and that's different for each tribe. And sometimes it's different for individuals within a tribe. So I think there's, if there's room for like the best practices manual or book that maybe the fine folks at Udall are working on or other panelists might collaborate on in the future, that would be one area where I think that everybody could use some help thinking through those issues because they differ so much from tribe to tribe. And like I said, within tribes. So I think that's all I have to say for that.
Thank
For
you,
now.
Hillary. Appreciate it. I'll turn to you, Kim. Did you have anything you wanted to add or thoughts just from hearing from the other panelists?
Not right off the bat. I have a bunch of notes that I've made over here just listening to the things, and I've been answering questions. So I do like the thought of the best management practices handbook that Hillary referred to there.
And exploring confidentiality. We do have some work we're working with U of A and Native Nations Institute on data sovereignty. And so we can follow up, if not in the chat, definitely as a follow-up to participants and our panelists on some of that work. It looks more towards maintaining the relationship both to the resources and the data and the information, but I think it could provide some really good best practices and tools on confidentiality as well.
It is really hard whenever you're putting together a good document and you have a lot of information there and you're afraid to get that information out to the public, and things slip by. So
yeah, for sure. And Kelly, did you want to add anything? I know we talked a bit about confidentiality.
We have, the Advisory Council has guidance on utilizing confidentiality in Section 106 process, but I think this issue, I think as a number of you have noted, is also being discussed in a much broader framework. And I've been participating on a work group with NARA, the National Archives and Records Administration, as well as other federal agencies, to see how we might better utilize CUI, the Controlled Unclassified Information program, in this arena, and share information and best practices. So I think it's evolving. I think more information's hopefully going to be forthcoming.
That's great to hear.
Sure. And Stephanie, I noticed in the chat, I'm sorry, one question that I didn't know how to answer in the chat, but someone asked, which are the 101D5 tribes, the ones that have replaced the Section 106 regulations with preservation ordinances? And it's the Seminole tribe and the Narragansett. Just want to follow up.
Great, thanks, Kelly. And that's actually a great segue. And I'm slightly stalling for time because I think Cody might have gotten called into council, but we'll see because his camera's off. So I'm just giving you time, Cody, to get back on camera when you're back. But we did have a question about Q&A. We're actually going to turn over. We'll let Cody jump in if he needs to the Q&A, and we'll be answering those both typing. I believe Kelly already answered a few, and some of you answered a few of the questions typing those responses. So if you'd like to see what was typed, you can click on that answer tab and just show all, and it'll show how our panelists responded to those questions and answers. And then we're going to actually start going through some of those Q's and A's and answer live, as well as folks want to ask a question. I can't guarantee we'll get everybody. We do have over 300 participants online, but we will try to answer as many questions as we get. If we don't get to the questions live or typing answers in the Q&A, we will be following up to the best of our abilities to identify and respond to those questions. So I did want to just answer that logistics question in terms of how we're answering questions and taking questions, and actually get into that if we can. So I'm just going to do a quick check and see. We already have one hand raised, so I'm going to get some more voices in the room. And Victoria, oh, we got a lot of hand raises. So Victoria, did you have a specific question for our panelists or a comment of your own experiences?
Yes, I actually do. My name is Victoria Flowers. I also work on several ASTM work groups. And one of the things that they're doing is trying to standardize some GIS mapping tools. And one of the reasons I am on this ASTM work group is because they want to get a handle on what mapping tribal lands looks like. And I immediately cautioned them and said, whoa, back up the truck. When you start talking about mapping tribal lands, you're either limiting them or not truly reflecting their needs. So this kind of goes along into the NEPA discussion and addressing what lands should be subject to tribal consultation when an action is proposed. So I just kind of wanted to let folks know on the call that this is happening. I'm attempting to get this stuff out nationally through some of the work groups that I'm on. And the way I'm trying to get some of this information out is going through the regional tribal committees, the RTOCs in the EPA world. So I just wanted to let folks know that because to me, it's a really dangerous precedence because there was no tribal participation on this work group before it actually started, and they were trying to define Indian lands without input from tribes. And as was said earlier, how that is described varies from tribe to tribe as well as member to member. So I just wanted to share that. Thank you.
Thank you, Victoria. It's a good comment. And if you want to share your contact info in the chat and anybody wants to connect with you, please feel free to use the chat as for some networking if you want to. I noticed some folks are already sharing contact information together. Any thoughts from our panelists on that?
That was very interesting. And Victoria, I put in the comments for you to send your contact information. I do a lot of work with ASTM and with GIS here too. So
Excellent.
yeah, we don't like people defining our land for us.
Yeah, and thanks, Kimberly. I actually shared this information with Tracy Horst as well. I work with Tracy on a steering committee. She works there at Choctaw, so she's another resource for this kind of information.
She's right down the hall from me. I'll go visit with her.
Excellent. I will let you both have some more of that coordination on the side. I'm going to move to we have a couple more questions in the Q&A. So I did want to get a couple of those, and then I'm going to come to some more of our hands raised. So we had it, I'll take your attention to, actually, we have the highest up vote from a question regarding the use of contractors. And I think this is from Christian. Our tribe often has to hire outside environmental consultation to conduct NEPA, CEQ, and HUD environmental assessments. What is a way to increase capacity for environmental staff to learn how to conduct environmental assessments, as this will allow additional tribal sovereignty? Any recommendations or suggestions to folks for that? That was one of our most popular questions in the Q&A box.
Here at Choctaw Nation, we have preferred vendors. So we kind of run them through a process of clearance before we start working with them. And then if we have bad experiences, then we can remove them from that preferred vendors list. And it's an ever rotating list.
Excellent. And I believe there are other grant and other opportunities for training and capacity building. So Christian and others will reach out to some of our contacts, and we can follow up with different resources that may be able to help with some of that capacity building. And I'll make sure to flag Cody when he gets on the line back from council chambers on that, because I know that's something Colville has done a lot of work with. So thank you, Christian and others who had that. I'm going to turn to one of our hands raised. So Brian Zettel, you should be able to ask your question. Go ahead. Brian?
Tribal Nations Technical Center of Expertise.
Brian?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Oh, sorry about that. I think I was must have been double muted. This is Brian Zettel with the Tribal Nations Technical Center of Expertise for the Corps of Engineers. We do a lot of work with tribes and with the DoD and trying to address some of the discussion topics today, particularly around, how to engage with tribes. And one thing I would offer is, our approach to it at the center and the advice that we often give to the other districts and DoD agencies we're working with is to, compliance is sort of like the least you can do, right? We have to do that. We have these statutes. You have to do compliance. People carry it out in different fashions all over the country, regardless of whether or not they're all core staff or if they're with a different DoD group. It's not wholly consistent in how it's applied and implemented. But at the end of the day, that's sort of the least you can do. And really what we've tried to push the people we're working with to do is to form meaningful relationships, either through their tribal liaison or through their planners or whoever the case may be, whoever the right person is, to form those relationships with the tribes in their AOR and look for opportunities to collaborate and learn about what resources and what areas are important to the tribe, and be an ally in evaluating the impacts to those different resources. A lot of times, the miscommunication comes from a lack of understanding on the part of the federal staff of that unique relationship that the tribes and the federal agencies have, and also, you know, of their worldviews and their perspectives, and something that doesn't seem, they're not making those connections on why the tribes might think something is important. And that comes from actually having a relationship and listening and talking outside of the compliance arena. And so I would just offer that up as one step. Many people in the Q&A were, you know, sort of saying, well, how should we communicate with tribes, and what can we do to better communicate? And a lot of it has to do with forming relationships and not just sending emails and letters when you're seeking a bit of information to check a box. Over.
Thanks, Brian. I think that's good advice, and I've heard many talk about that as a best practice, is to remember that when we look at some of the guidelines and the policies, that's like the benchmark by which we cannot go below. It doesn't mean we can't go above. And that actually relates to another question we have in the Q&A box. And Catherine, I apologize. I might shorten your question just a little bit, but I do encourage folks to read it. We've got a lot of upvotes on that one. But basically dealing with how each agency has its own NEPA policy handbook. And some of those handbooks can be perceived, real or perceived, to be the policy could be damaging to the environment. And so the question is really how some of you see, how can collaboration work when policy seems to be written in favor of doing damage to the environment, when there is that concern about how the policy is written and whether or not it's meeting the needs of Indigenous nations. And apology, Catherine, for altering that a little bit. I just want to make sure I could get the general gist, and I'm asking my panelists to review the question as written as well. Hillary, I kind of saw you shaking your head. Do you have any thoughts, or I'll see if others want to jump in?
That's such a tough one. I was nodding because I think it's a really good question. And if I understand it right, is the agency action non-discretionary, or is it discretionary, but like the policy favors the outcome that is harmful to the tribal resource or interest?
I think generally the question deals with policies that seem to favor oil companies and cattle ranchers, but I think the distinction you're pointing out is whether it's discretionary or non-discretionary, and where those lines fit in terms of policy. That might be a good area to explore.
Yeah, so I guess I'll pick discretionary. But, you know, I mean, it does raise the question of, again, what I was talking about earlier with like federal law and what federal law allows and prohibits, and then tribal law and what it allows and prohibits, and then, you know, the intersection of those, and the Supreme Court's really imperfect drawing of the boundaries, like in the case like McGirt that Kim was talking about. So I think, and I'll have to speak kind of generally about this, but I've seen it happen. So where there's discretion, and it's like under a general multiple use kind of statute, or a statute that allows the agency to go in one of many directions, I think it can be really hard to get agency momentum to change, and to change kind of the status quo thinking about like resources. And like somebody else was talking about those labels. And I think that's going to be something that we'll see in Bears Ears, is like the way that agencies have traditionally managed national monuments and multiple use public lands includes all these different categories of quote unquote resources. And cultural resources is like one of those buckets. And then there are all these different other categories. But from the tribal perspective, those buckets can't exist if, like in the Bears Ears case, if the tribal land management plan is to be carried out and is to become part of the combined collaborative management plan, those silos have to break down, and there needs to be an incorporation of the tribal cultural values into those other buckets that touch on hydrology, forage management or grazing management, management of mineral extraction. So That's just such a good question. I don't have the answer, but it's something I'm thinking about a lot, and I would welcome any input from those in the audience or other panelists on further thoughts on that one.
Any additional thoughts from our other panelists, Cody, Kelly, in terms of, that policy discretion, non-discretionary, discretionary, and some next steps? We saw an anonymous comment also pointing out and questioning whether new legislation, the Respect Act, could be an avenue for addressing some of this in different ways. Cody?
Sure, I'll take a stab at it. We've got a few examples of this, actually. Probably the best one that we worked on for the last few years with the Intertribal Timber Council is expansion of the Good Neighbor Authority. So it seems clear to me that Congress's intent was to expand all of the authorities of Good Neighbor to tribes and counties. But Department of Agriculture's interpretation was because tribes and counties were not included lower in the law where it says they have the ability to spend program revenue, they restricted that to just the governor. So although tribes and counties may do these projects and generate program income that could be used to help pay for planning and NEPA on the following projects to kind of increase the pace and scale at which we're doing restoration work, that's not the way the agency interpreted Congress's intent. So now we have to go back to Congress and get legislative language that adds those further down in the law and brings that clarity. But from a discretionary standpoint, it seems clear to me, and I think most people I've talked to, that if tribes and counties were included in the authority, that they would have all of the authorities, not a limited scope unless it was explicitly excluded. So those are challenges. And we have another example where it was an appropriations bill that funded a particular project where we disagree with Bonneville Power Administration about what the intent of it was or what the limitations are. And I would agree that in our experience, you don't get a lot of wiggle room. Once the solicitors have issued an opinion, they don't typically change it. So you have to work through other channels outside of the agency, sometimes at Congress, to work on what a legislative fix or at least some testimony or some other legislative intent that helps change the perspectives of those federal agencies.
Thanks, Cody. Anybody have anything to add on that? We've got a lot of questions. It's folks are very excited. I just want to check in with my colleague, Seth. Seth, I noticed your hand was up. Was there some questions or comments you wanted to flag for us for the panel?
If you can hear me, I was just going to share, there were a few questions in there about how to see the answers to chat question or to the Q&A questions. And although I don't think we have a magic solution for this, on some of them have been answered by text or have written answers. You can just expand the question, like right below where the question is, it'll say expand, and there you can see the answer. Like there's a couple in the beginning from Kelly and others where it says show all. So that may be the way to see some of the replies that have been.
Oh, good.
Thanks,
Seth. Appreciate it. And we will be copying all the questions and answers, the typed answers, and share those out with folks so they can see what was shared and answered in the Q&A. But let's see, the next most popular question we have is actually from Michelle. With several tribes I've worked with, tribal members are uncomfortable speaking, commenting about a project because they feel like they are speaking for the tribe. How can you work through that? And it got pushed down. How can you work through that in developing trust to gain that valuable collaboration and input? Any thoughts or suggestions or experiences to share on? I realize each of you can only speak on your own personal behalf, but maybe Hillary, you can cover this since you work with multiple tribes with different perspectives and individuals.
Yeah, and I think in Bears Ears, it's been really helpful for there to be clear lines. So like the Intertribal Coalition only works with the commission, and those are elected tribal leaders from each of the 5 tribes. So we're very clear that when we speak, we're speaking sort of with the blessing of the commission. So it's coming from that level of government on the tribal side. But I've seen in my work that agency staff have made a lot of just personal connections with different tribal members, whether it's in TIPO offices or like with the Hopi Cultural Resources Advisory Team at the Hopi tribe. And I think, there are different channels, and I think it's really important for, like, even in Bears Ears, there's still government to government consultation that's happening under different statutes, even though the presidential proclamation under the Antiquities Act allows for extensive engagement with the Bears Ears Commission. So keeping all of those avenues open and those channels open, I think allows for tribal members and then like tribal advocacy organizations to weigh in with agencies in a different way than the elected leaders do.
Thanks, Hillary. Cody or Kim, I'll turn to you to see if you wanted to add anything to that.
So just to clarify, it was at the staff level. Staff was concerned about commenting on behalf. So the way we handled that is we have the staff draft comments. It's vetted through our administrative review process and then presented to the council for their approval. And then it gets the chairman's signature. So everybody's clear about where it comes from. And for those that have pretty large established tribal governments, almost always does a letter from the chairman mean more than from somebody at the staff level. So we always encourage our staff, if it's an important issue, make sure we get that in front of the council and we get the chairman's signature on the document.
Thank you, Cody. I think this is really good, for some tribal staff, maybe new staff or folks that aren't used to working with the tribe they're working for. This is really good as a reminder of those processes, as well as targeting the complexity of intergovernmental relationships in NEPA, that there are tribal governance systems and processes in place that need to be tracked. And it's an important component of that government to government relationship and ensuring that there's processes that allow the tribes to engage in the appropriate way. So Michelle, thank you for the great question. Thank you, Cody and Kim. Did you want to add anything, Cody?
Yes, please. So I will say, having said that, from a consultation perspective, that's government to government. So from high level political officials to elected tribal officials, but there should be communication at the lower staff level to make sure that we're moving agenda items forward. And then once we get to decision points or things where the tribe see issues, that's when you elevate those to a more consultation or tribal letterhead signed by the chairman. So I don't want to discourage communication at the lower levels, having said that.
Thank you. That's an important distinction for the collaboration to occur, but understanding the official opinion of the tribe needs to come from the tribal governance systems, but there's still collaboration and flagging and working through issues to get to that point. So thank you, Cody, for clarifying that. I think it's really important. And we have a hand raised that I think might be on this. So Miranda, I'm going to open up your line if you want to go ahead and share something.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Yeah, I just wanted to jump in on that. Miranda Compton, I am president of Lepway, a consulting company and citizen of the Delaware tribe. I think a lot of tribal staff level and even, tribal citizens are hesitant to comment because I think federal agencies and project proponents coming to tribes frequently don't do so with the knowledge of the tribal governance and authority. I think what Cody just mentioned is great in the sense that just as we wouldn't expect a staff level person within Forest Service or Army Corps to be able to make certain decisions, those have to go up the chain of command. The same is true in Indian country. So in terms of establishing an appropriate framework for coordination, which I think is different than consultation, consultation will be that government to government level, and coordination is more on the staff level, and should occur. That's really the successful relationships that go above and beyond compliance. So I think when you're approaching a tribe, really clarifying that any input or dialogue that's occurring at a staff level or even occurring outside of the official tribal government is just coordination and dialogue and doesn't take the place of consultation. So really that hesitancy can be diminished if there is upfront a clear establishment of roles of authority and the respect of tribal governments as governments, just like the federal government and state governments.
Thank you, Miranda. I think this is a great reminder for us all, both of our tribal and federal agency participants, to kind of think through all the pieces that get involved in a NEPA process, government to government consultation, staff to staff collaboration, NHPA, et cetera. So I really appreciate those comments. I'm actually going to leave you with the ability to jump on. And I have a question that we actually got in both the comments and a little bit before anonymously. And I'm synthesizing a number of different comments, but we had some questions about the role of private project sponsors and kind of the interaction with corporations and private developers that are seeking to develop projects on federal lands where NEPA process might be invoked, and kind of where you see how to navigate the role of the private project sponsor, as well as the role tribes can in interacting with those. So I'm going to go to my panelists and see if you have any thoughts in terms of that dynamic with private project corporations in NEPA processes, and then the NEPA process in general and the government to government interactions.
I can take a shot at that one. We've got a few examples of that as well. So the good example of that is the project proponents reaching out to the tribe to have that discussion as they start the permitting process with whatever federal agency they're working with, so that they understand what the tribe's perspectives are, if they have any concerns about the project, and try to address those or mitigate for those in the project proposal before they get too far down the road. What we more typically see is that they just work through whatever permitting agency they need to work through and leave the consultation process up to the federal government. So they never really have that communication, and they just have a very specific agenda for the project they want to accomplish, and they don't necessarily worry about what the tribes want to do unless it stops or holds up one of their objectives.
Thanks, Cody. Anything to add from our other panelists? All right, so really emphasizing that there is a role for private parties to engage with the tribes and provide some input. We also got a comment of, and this could relate to it. It seems like the best practices, the comment we saw was with respect to best practices, federal agencies developing a potential impacts to the tribes. So an early assessment at the beginning of the NEPA process of this is what we've heard, this is what we've seen as a potential impact to the tribe, and then initiate consultation. There could be a role for project proponents to also do the analysis of this is what we anticipate as a potential impact to the tribe. And I think we also saw some questions of how tribes could do some of those cultural resource analysis as well. So any thoughts on that as a potential best practice or consideration in NEPA as an opportunity to get tribal voices and potential impacts early into that analysis process?
Well,
Kim?
that's a hefty goal, and it would be awesome for that to happen. I haven't experienced that over here. I also haven't experienced any private entities coming to the tribe to talk to us about what impacts their projects may have on our reservation land. So I'm going to listen to the answers here.
So,
Cody?
question on that one. So this would be a document that the federal agency would develop and send to the tribes, and they would have to make presumptions that they knew what the impacts to the tribe would be?
Yes, I believe the best practice was the federal agency do a first analysis based on previous tribal comments or similar projects, basically say, we looked at what you've told us already, and this is what we think, but we could be wrong. What do you think?
It's something they could take a stab at, but in my experience, if they've got good like tribal liaisons or staff that work regularly, they probably have a good handle on what the tribal concerns are and what our expectations are. But if they don't, in my experience, particularly working with the Forest Service, is they have such regular turnover, they don't know anybody on the tribal system. So they would be making assumptions based on some unknown set of criteria that they came up with when they got to the forest, and who knows what they would send the tribe. So good in concept, but it would be a slippery slope. I'm not sure how successful they would be about it. Almost certainly it would be inconsistent at best.
Good caveat for that comment. Excellent. And then we have a couple questions that I can easily answer, and that's Hillary, if you could put the link to the management plan in the chat box. Folks are really interested in seeing that. And I'm just going to answer those. We have a number of questions. I'm just going to pull up the most popular that from participants we haven't heard from. And then we also we have a very lively chat. I don't know if you're all checking the chat. We will be recording the chat, but we have a very lively chat of questions and comments on some of what you all have touched, both reaffirming what you've said and also, caveating some situations in terms of the role of private industry and private project proponents. So one of the most popular we have right now, I think, Kelly, you're starting to answer that in terms of, hesitance from tribes to share confidential sacred sites information and how to navigate that. And Kelly did answer that. If folks want to take a look at that, they can look at the answer, and there's a little box that you should be able to see the answer. If not, like we said, we will share those. Did you want to add anything, Kelly, to that answer of when there's a hesitance from tribes in terms of sharing confidential information in a NEPA process?
Yeah, so, based on my experience in the 106 world, I think it's important at the onset of whether it's the communication, the consultation, the information sharing, for the federal agency to recognize the limitations on our ability to protect information, to be clear about where we can protect information and what information we may not be able to protect. Because I think all parties need to have the same understanding of what sort of the obligations of the federal agency are in regards to transparency and confidentiality. The Advisory Council has for quite some time now advised the agencies we work with, when you go into a consultation, knowing that there may be sensitive information discussed, see if there are ways you can accommodate that. Obviously, talking about limitations once that information is in federal hands, but what about not writing it down? What about being very focused in the conversation, in the questions? How much information do you actually need to do your review process? For 106, when we talk about identifying historic properties, there may be some information that the federal agency would need in regards to boundaries, some generalized information about why the property is significant or how it might not be how it may be affected by a proposed undertaking, but they may not necessarily need the entire origin story of this site and then put that information at risk of being disclosed. So, as I said in my answer to the Q&A, I do hope additional information or guidance will be forthcoming about how to protect traditional knowledge moving forward. I think there's been a lot more awareness on that issue in the past couple of years, but it's an ongoing challenge. And unfortunately, I don't have a magic solution at hand. We did have guidance. The link I provided was the ACHP's guidance on utilizing Section 304 that I referenced earlier in the 106 context, but there may be other laws. And for, the federal agency colleagues on the call today, if you're aware of agency-specific procedures or regulations that allow you to protect information, share that information, because we want to learn from others if there's something we're missing out there.
Thank you, Kelly. Appreciate that. And we have actually, I'm looking through some of the questions. The most popular current one right now, it deals with plant gathering. This is from Lee. Plant gathering areas can be addressed under Section 106 as they can be considered tribal cultural properties, which is a type of significance under 106. The areas can be a district if not confined to smaller enough area to simply refer to it as a site. So not necessarily a question, but more of a comment. Is there anything to add about, plant gathering sites or identification of districts and how that might relate in a NEPA process? Do we have anything we want to add to that comment? Kelly, I'll go to you first.
Well, under NEPA, I don't think you need to make it meet the National Register criteria, because it is its own natural resource, if not a sacred site or other resource type. The challenge is under 106. And I think Lee raised a point, looking to traditional cultural properties, and the Park Service has issued a bulletin about how to identify those sites. But I would actually say, for sites of significance to Indian tribes or Native Hawaiian organizations, start at the statutory language. So the National Historic Preservation Act specifically calls out that properties of significance to tribes and Native Hawaiian organizations may be eligible for the register. Pair that with the 106 regulations that require federal agencies to recognize the expertise of tribes and Native Hawaiian organizations in evaluating the potential eligibility of those sites. And at least in my view, you know, we're trying to tend to lean in to, if the tribe says this is significant, it's significant. Now, I don't work for the National Register. That's, you know, the advisory council is not part of the National Park Service. I don't want to speak on behalf of the National Register, but in our 106 consultation and the advice we give, we absolutely tell federal agencies to rely on the expertise of tribal consulting parties when they're telling you a site is significant and why.
Thank you, Kelly. Anything to add, Cody, Kim, or Hillary?
I could just add
That's
from the
all I
management.
would add is, oh,
Go
go ahead.
Hillary. No, go ahead.
Hillary, then Cody.
I would just echo that I think there's a need for alignment of law here and alignment of federal agencies on an interagency basis, because I think it can be an area where tribal members are really reluctant to trust in, you know, the I don't know what the right word is, but it's like, it is an exercise in trust. So if you don't write something down, but you speak it verbally, you're still sharing that information and you don't know what is going to happen to it after you share it. And so I've seen a reluctance, and I think a justified reluctance in sharing information. And I think, to Kelly's point, that sometimes there can be a way of weaving between, like, you know, knowing that a spring, there needs to be silence surrounding a spring during certain times of year in a national monument, and that's a cultural value that needs to be protected. You don't necessarily need to know why that has to happen, but that it has to happen. But I just think it's tricky, especially if the agencies want to, you know, satisfy like the baseline legal requirements and not go above those.
Go ahead, Cody.
And the only thing I would add is that there may be different things you're trying to accomplish. So make the distinction whether you have some management goals that you're trying to accomplish to improve whatever that cultural resource is. So say huckleberries or camas or bitterroot access and abundance on the landscape versus where you have an archaeological site where you want it protected and you want that held very confidential. So, I mean, there's two different things. And we look at cultural resources, we use that as a pretty encompassing term. And a lot of times what we're trying to accomplish are two very different things depending on what that cultural resource is and what we use or want it protected for.
Thank you. And I'm sure you all cannot look at all the chat. It's amazing, the conversation and sharing that's happening in our chat. And we will be sharing the chat with folks so you can take a look at it. Lots of great comments and suggestions and networking happening. You both talked a little bit about interagency coordination and kind of the limits of laws. And so we do have a question, a Q&A that's got the most popular upvotes at this point from Sally Manning about compliance with the law is at least or minimum. What an agency needs to do according to the law is where we're dealing with the issue. And I think this touches on what you were talking about, Hillary, a little bit about coordination between agencies as well as, you know, what the law says. And I think what Sally's question is talking about is, you know, the limitations federal agency staff might have, and we heard this in the chat as well, that you know, there may be a hesitance or an unwillingness to go above and beyond what the law says, particularly if district leadership or local leadership or agency leads, so the boss is what Sally has, it doesn't insist that you do it or doesn't give you the time and resources to prioritize that. So Sally's question is, are there any obvious fixes to the law or the current framework? Is there a possibility? She's got a couple different suggestions about a lead agency to get a permit from a tribe, requiring consultation that ends in consultation or consensus, my apologies, give rights to the tribe to consider cultural resources. So she's got a couple ideas out there. And I know, you know, within our framework, we can't change the law. We can't identify the law. What we can do is, you know, in the implementation process. But if you have some suggestions for Sally, I'd appreciate that. And I think the others would. And if you have some implementation recommendations of how to get past those restrictions where you might not have all the support you want to go above and beyond the law, that would be great as well. So we can either just leave it as is because it's a great comment question, but if you had any suggestions, I wanted to throw that back to the panelists.
I would just comment that almost all federal agencies have a lot of authorities, a lot of flexibility. And a lot of times those laws are interpretations that they use to either diminish their decision-making authority or expand their decision-making authority. So I don't know that I have a solution for it, but again, building those personal relationships with your local agency, I think gives them some comfort to stretch those authorities as far as they can.
Hillary?
Yeah, and I guess I would say that I just having in 2020, I actually published a book on the laws that relate to cultural resources protection for Indigenous nations in the United States. And the conclusion that I reached with my co-author at the end of that book was that over time, like this system of laws that have been layered one upon the other, they apply in ways that overreach and then apply in ways that completely leave gaps and don't cover critical areas. And so at a fundamental level, there needs to be, tribally designed laws but then when you look at, the 374 federally recognized tribes and then maybe 150 other unrecognized tribes, you're talking about vastly different values. You're talking about complex issues of history and, like removal and allotment and all those different federal policies that have impacted the tribal land base over time and tribal sovereignty. So it's not a simple problem. I think it's vital. Like as we move into in the United States, this era of collaborative management, which I think there's really a lot of growing interest in collaborating. Like tribes are really interested in collaborating with federal agencies, even with states sometimes, which is pretty remarkable. The law is just going to need to catch up to that willingness and that, this moment in time, I think, and it's not anywhere close, I guess, is my overarching takeaway. That's not a very happy note, but.
Kim, I know you had your mic open and you don't have to end with a happy note, but I want to give you a chance to weigh in.
I don't know. I was just thinking that these things that we're talking about with other agencies also impact decisions within the tribe, because different departments within the tribe will look at the guidance and the regulation in different ways, because some departments want to rush things through, and if there's not clear guidance there, doesn't matter what the overall picture is. So if we had something with a little bit more guidance, a little bit more cooperative agreements and stuff, I don't know where we would start. I'm very interested in this book that Hillary was just referring to, because, it's a constant problem, not just with the outside agencies, the private agencies, but within our own internally. So.
All right. Well, so we wanted to identify some next steps and call to action. So I think this might be an area where we can continue to explore. There's a couple questions we got in the comments, and this actually relates to, there's references both to what smaller tribes can do. So Kim, this might be something for you to consider, but Cody, I'm sure you can weigh in based on your other tribal partners, and Hillary and Kelly as well. But kind of bringing into the discussion where Endangered Species Act comes into the NEPA processes and kind of critical habitat surveys, and whether or not those critical habitat surveys are conducted within tribal reservation boundaries and how that might impact a NEPA analysis. So there's a larger question. I'll just read it really quick. For larger tribes with in-house biologist expertise, they can provide their input to determine whether NEPA federal actions, farming, grazing, forestry projects will have an impact, and what they consider ESA critical habitat, sensitive traditional foods, or other natural resource impacts within reservations for federal actions during NEPA compliance evaluations. for smaller tribes that lack that capacity, what, if anything, can federal agencies do to provide and assist tribes in protecting those Endangered Species Act species? What do we do if there's a no critical habitat finding, or if it's not mapped, and how to really make sure that that meaningful engagement incorporates tribal perspectives and concerns on those endangered species? Thoughts?
Let me take a crack at it.
Go for it, Cody.
So anybody who's familiar with the Northwest, lots of endangered species in the Northwest. So we deal with this on a very regular basis. And this is difficult because, as has been stated, a lot of tribes don't have a lot of trust in the federal government. So even if it's another federal agency that's reaching out to try to assist them, sometimes their perspectives don't align with what the tribal perspectives are. So I think the tribes have opportunities, and particularly for those small land-based tribes, these can be problems. If it's an area that's identified as core habitat or critical habitat and there's restrictions on it, that can handcuff management activities on what limited land base they have left. And in a lot of cases, it changes what's available for accomplishments on adjacent federal land. So if you look at, say, Washington State, there's 29 tribes. There's 4 of us on the east side, and the other 25 are kind of crammed into Western Washington on the west side of the Cascade. So there's a lot of overlap and a lot of really conflicting perspectives on how resources should be managed. And it's mostly salmon in Western Washington. But as far as how you balance access, subsistence use, and a population that's harvestable with protection of the species in perpetuity, those are hard challenges to deal with. So I don't know that the federal agencies can do a great job with helping the tribes assess that. I think for the most part, their understanding of the issues, even if they don't necessarily have technical staff that can go out and do monitoring and evaluation reports to tell you exactly what the trends are, they recognize it. They're out there on the landscape, so they can see it even if they don't have a data set to support it. But I think sharing what you have is always helpful. The tribes will use it to the extent they think it's helpful for them, and just make the offer. If they want the help, I'm sure they will take the help. If they don't trust the help, they may tell you that, and then you can work on the relationship building to ensure that if you do have information that you feel like it's helpful, you can gain that trust with the tribe so that they'll utilize that to help inform their decision making.
Kim, do you have anything to add with this? Has this come up for you?
We have no critical habitat defined within our reservation area, but we've done extensive research with some of our staff members that have their degrees in biology. We don't have a biologist on our staff, but we use their degrees and their experience, and we've mapped out the habitats and the species for each one of our districts. And so we put really detailed assessments in our IPAC, and then we run that by BIA and see how they feel about that before we move forward with it. The way that things are written, it's like one of the previous questions. Things are written to where you can very easily get projects through based on the information that's there, and not particularly be protecting the species, but we're very proactive in protecting our species here.
Great, thank you. I do want to note that we are coming close to our time today, and we still have a lot of questions that we haven't been able to get to. So I do want to let folks know that we will follow up with as many of the questions as we can. And to the extent we can get some responses from our panelists, we will. There's been a lot of questions and resources shared in the chat box, so we'll be sharing that as well. So both the answered and unanswered questions, and then some responses that we can get together, we'll pull in there. Such a great and robust discussion. You know, we knew we were going to hear a lot of different perspectives, but some new things that came up that we weren't expecting quite as much interaction with was some very profound discussions on the role of private sponsorships and the trust issues. Kind of expected some of that, but a little bit more robust than we thought. Definitely some really good point outs for Endangered Species Act and critical habitats, as well as the dynamics between larger tribes with a little bit more capacity, as well as tribes that may not have the capacity and are building it up. And Kim, thank you for the suggestions of calling on tribal members and their academic expertise as a possibility to bring that in. We have to get creative sometimes. Really good discussions of, where we need to go, both what we can do collaboratively as well as what we can do and consider to call out as issues that could be done from an interagency coordination perspective, or that tribes may want to suggest in terms of government to government or legislative changes to be more responsive. I do want to thank our panelists for jumping in, and for our participants. If we didn't get your questions answered, I apologize. There's just so many. I do want to leave with one question because I think it relates to a lot of what we've been talking about. And perhaps this is something we can reach out to all of you to share after this webinar or in future discussions, and please feel free to share now. But Kurt had a really good comment about a lot of reference to consultation, whether it's consultation in NHPA, consultation through a NEPA process, or government to government consultation. As Cody, you and Miranda were talking about, that dynamic between government to government consultation, collaboration and consultation, just meeting of minds and governmental entities. So Kurt's question really deals with bringing in the concept of core principles of talking circles and peacemaking, and thinking through those government to government actions. And he asks, what are some of your best, most constructive experiences of consultation when you're communicating communicating these topics across very different cultures? So I just want to see if we have any thoughts of what are some best experiences that folks might share? And I'm going to reach out to the chat box, and this could be a conversation we continue to have after the webinar, but I'll see if any of our panelists have anything to leave us with from Kurt's question. Kelly?
Well, I saw Cody went off mute. So Cody, you go first.
Go ahead, Kelly. I talk a lot.
Well, this will be pretty quick, but it is under the Section 106 umbrella. So one of, I think, my best consultation moments was a case I actually had with the National Guard many years ago. And we were working on an airport expansion, and the Guard was hitting some roadblocks, stumbled a little bit in their efforts, and we got wrapped around the axle. And we had an on-site meeting. It was a 3-day meeting where the agency, the state office, my office, 2 different tribal offices came together, walked the site, talked about the resources, talked about concerns, had dinner together. The next day, we sat together in a room looking at an agreement document and went through line by line, and we all contributed to that language. And I think ultimately, in that case, I know at least one tribe was not necessarily happy with the project, but I think that process allowed for more input. And that, in my mind, is collaboration. That actually sitting down together and working this type of agreement, this back and forth dialogue, I think I personally found and thought that was pretty successful 106.
Great. Cody?
An important thing about consultation is you'll hear tribes use the word meaningful consultation regularly. And I think where I've had success at Colville, and I've heard success from other tribes, is when an agency can come in and explain to you how they considered your comments, how they considered that consultation, and how that factored into their decision making. So whether you ended up at the decision you wanted or not, the agency should be able to explain how they considered your comments and how that factored into their final decision. So I think, again, we can provide comments in a lot of different situations, but that's, I think, a fear of a lot of tribes is that you submit comments over and over. And I mean, like our Tribal Historic Preservation Officer, I think he said he submits 6,000 a year. What comes of those, who knows? But if you really want that to be meaningful and you want the tribes to engage, you need to explain to them how it's beneficial to you, how you're using that information.
Thanks, Cody. Kim or Hillary, anything to add, Kim? Thanks, Kim. Hillary or Kim, go ahead.
I was just going to say nothing meaningful. So
any takeaways to share with, we have one question for takeaways to share with federal employees to improve collaboration. So
I say
you can add
take,
that.
take the time to listen. Slow down, go slow down.
We can echo that. And I wanted to kind of, oh, Kim, were you done? Okay. I wanted to just chime in and say that one thing that's been really exciting to see in Bears Ears, it's not directly related to NEPA, but the idea of collaboration is the excitement on both sides. The agency staff from the top levels down on the tribal side, from the governmental level on down through tribal staff, and then tribal members who are serving the Bears Ears in different capacities. Everybody's so excited because this is something new. They feel that it's something different, and everybody's excited to work together. So what kicked that off in Bears Ears most recently was the signing of a cooperative agreement between the agencies and the tribes that kind of mapped out the next couple of years. And as part of that, we did a field trip out to a sign unveiling of the first national monument sign that had the tribal seals of each of the 5 tribes on the federal sign. And then we all went to a restoration ceremony and celebration that the Intertribal Coalition put on, and the agency staff all showed up. They all ate food with, the tribal leaders and with coalition staff and a lot of the NGO partners that had helped us on the way to restoring the monument. And so I saw somebody had mentioned in the chat that eating food together was really important. And I think that was one of the opening themes by one of our hosts today. So anyway, I just wanted to share that because it's been exciting. It's not going to be without its bumps, I think, but it's been an exciting start.
Great, thank you. And I am cognizant of time and just so incredibly grateful to all of you for sharing your time with us today. Clearly, there's so much still to discuss. We have a couple requests for in-person symposium to continue the dialogue. So we'll do our best to follow up with all of the great discussion and comments and suggestions and networking and resources that have been shared today. Please feel free to reach out if folks have any additional questions or comments. We'll stay on a little bit more to just make sure we get all of everybody's questions or comments. But I want to thank you all for taking your time today, and just I know Brian wants to do a quick closeout for us, but any last thoughts or questions or comments from our panelists before we go? Cody?
I have one. So I know, Hillary, you thought your comment was kind of a bleak picture of the history of federal Indian policy, but I've been at this for about 25 years now, and I will say we have come a long way since I started in the early 2000s. So the fact that we're having this conversation, the fact that we're having federal agencies engage in this outside of BIA, because when I started my career, well, trust responsibility, that's a BIA thing. That's not for any of the other federal agencies. So the fact that we've got all federal agencies present here, or many of them, and that outreach occurs across the board is huge strides from where we were 20 years ago. So while the history is bad, we're making progress, and based on what Congress has passed, the authorities they've granted over the last half dozen years, we're continuing to make progress. So this is a good thing.
I don't know if anybody wants to add after that, but open to you. All right. Thank you, Cody, as always, for sharing the best last words. But I am going to give the dubious task to Brian to close us out for today. So Brian, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Are you sure nobody else wants to go in between Cody and me? So yeah, we just have a couple minutes left. We're just sharing some next steps here. I just want to echo Stephanie's thoughts and thank our panel. What an amazing discussion. And our participants. I mean, the chat just flowed from beginning to end. Everybody was engaged. This was truly a wonderful couple hours to spend with you all today. I want to thank our Udall Foundation team, particularly our moderator, Stephanie Lucero, who did a fantastic job monitoring all of that feedback coming through. Also want to thank our partners at the EPA Office for Environmental Justice and their team, Danny and his team, for their partnership in this. So people asked about the recording. We are recording this. We are going to put it out on our YouTube site, so we'll send that out to participants. We also are developing a background paper or white paper of sorts. We developed a draft of it and shared it with our panelists. We want to take the feedback we've heard here and revise it, update it, and create a resource moving forward. We heard thoughts and requests for maybe putting together a symposium or something. We would consider something like that, given the energy we heard here today. It feels, we want to address issues where there is energy and there's interest. So we would consider that, but some other related events and resources. This, as I mentioned, is our third NEPA Next 50 workshop. You can find our notes from our previous ones on our website, udall.gov. In partnership with the EPA's Environmental Justice Webinar Series. They also did a very similar engagement a couple months ago. You can find that there on their website, epa.gov//environmental justice. And then we're also still awaiting a paper from the Udall Center for Studies in Public Policy, who did a formal survey on NEPA, collaboration in NEPA, and they are publishing a paper on that. So that should be coming out soon. And if you could go to the next slide, Lauren. And then just a note, we have a couple trainings coming up which are right on topic. These are really for federal audiences, mostly, I should say, particularly that first one, collaboration with Native Nations and tribal consultation. That's in October in DC. And then we have a virtual course on collaboration in NEPA. That's coming up in December. So you can find more information at udall.gov, or you can email training@udall.gov. And that's it. So we're right on time. Thanks again, everybody. And just want to wish everybody a fantastic day and a great rest of your week.
Thank you, everyone.